Welcome back to the fifth in this series of training on raising funds and developing stewards for a new church start. We've covered biblical foundation and spent a considerable time on that subject. We've talked about strategic planning, the fact that people want to give to your vision for the future. You have to articulate it well. We've talked about effective communication. We've talked about change emotions and change communication. We've talked about earning the right to receive $1 and a donation from another. Today we go into the gearbox of skills and methods surrounding raising external funds and raising internal funds. External funds relate to those individuals that will never be a part of your ministry per se. I mean, they're part of your ministry because stewardship development is ministry, right? Fundraising is ministry. It's not a means to an end. Remember the Henry Nouwen reading that we jumped into our first session together. It's not a means to an end. It is a discipleship engagement that you're having with others. Every dimension of what you're doing in this project is disciple making. But there will be some that will be actually, integral to your ministry in the startup of the new faith community. And so raising their stewardship quotient and raising the stewardship quotient of those that will not be part of your specific church plant is what this particular training is going to go into at the level of skills and methods. All right, so this is going to get a little bit gritty. So if you need to stop the tape at several junctures, go out and go for a walk around the block or what have you, please kind of hang in there because we're going to go through some stuff that may feel a little tedious, but I want to make sure and communicate just in fairness to those of you for whom it will be very relevant for you. Raising external startup funds. How much will you need? I mean, planting is time sensitive and you need time. And the goal is to be self-sustaining and to avoid external dependency. Where will that money come from? So learning to grow individual external donors is part of what you have to do, and we've talked about that. So let's go a little deeper into calculating what your church plant need will be. Here's a formula. It's one that my hunch your stakeholders are thinking about. It's certainly one that the area director for new church development is thinking about, is how many people with a job do you believe you can realistically enfold into your plant in 3 to 4 years? If you multiply that number by the average monthly giving of any one of those individuals, and that number by 12, you end up with a projected annual income of your faith community. The number that normally goes into the blank there is $125 per month per person with a job. That's a number that's been tested, and you'll find lots of exceptions to it. But when you flatten everything out, that's a number that tends to prevail at around about a 3% income on a $40,000 a year salary. There's a way of calculating then what your church plant will revenue in about the third or fourth year. Is if you take the number of donors, people with a job, multiply it by that $125, multiply that by 12 months, and you get an annualized number. Graduate your internal giving then upwards. That is the giving that will come from these new attendees each year, and your external giving downwards. You get a picture of the process whereby new givers coming from the mission field, coming from the harvest, will begin to take the place of conference dollars. That's a good thing, right? And then you add up that total external need for each year for a total external funding amount. That's the amount of money that you need to raise in your church start. That's the amount of money that will be required in order to support you from the conference or from other donors to get your ministry up and running. Now, from the standpoint of the Minnesota Annual Conference and the Dakotas Annual Conference, the expectation will be that for many or most of you that you raise 10% of that. The 10% of that total external need comes from your relationship with family and friends and prior acquaintances and others in your life, that you will grow into a partnership relationship that we've been talking about as donors. So here's an example, fairly imperfect one, but it gives you a quick snapshot. The total projected employed people, 75 people. The total monthly projected giving, $9,000. The total annualized internal giving, $108,000. That outcome then would require, if you were to sequence it or graduate it over a 4-year period of time, it would say that internal giving during the first year, we could only hope that about 10%, let's say, that you're able to raise and might come from a fledgling core group will come in year number 1. Whereas 99,000 would come in from the annual conference or other major contributors from the denomination. Year number 2, you've grown in your internal giving as more people have stepped up and you've had a launch in the ministry. Year number 3, etc. Year number 4, and the external giving begins to drop off. From this snapshot, you get a total external commitment need of $203,000. Now, this is a very simplistic, and I'll grant you probably a excessively modest, let's say even stingy financial plan for most of us. Our startup expenses will be more, will require a greater investment from outside of the ministry in order to get it off the ground. But take it as a model and get a picture of the sequencing and the building up of that model and how then you would build your own funding model for your ministry. Where can startup funds come from? Okay, they can come from local tithes and offerings. And one of the things I remind planters is don't start taking up a collection when you start having public worship. It's too late. Well, it's not maybe too late, but you should begin collecting offerings when you start your first small group. I wouldn't conclude a small group gathering without putting a hat in the middle of the group and say, part of what it means to be in this process and to be a part of this endeavor is for us to all grow in the grace of giving as stewards, and then put the hat out and say, every contribution you make goes towards the mission, the vision that we have together. And in fact, if you count yourself as part of the launch team, I'm asking you directly to have a conversation with your spouse, take into consideration the need we have to be self-funding and to achieve a certain funding level for this year, whether that be $10,000 or $15,000 a year from the core group or whatever that number may be, to share that number with them and say, make that a practice from this first day forward that we're going to collect offerings in order for this ministry to get off the ground. Personal fundraising outside of that small group with friends and relationships, bivocational income, parent church support, partner church support, regional friends support, denominational support, micro-enterprising, rummage sales, foundation, government grants. I mean, these are all multi-stream revenues. I must say, I unfortunately, however, see way too many planners put way too much time and energy into rummage sales and pursuing government grants and even into bivocationalism. I have nothing against those, but I see way too many planters selling themselves short, not believing that people have resources. I told a story a couple sessions ago about my parents in their mid-80s, kind of wishing that more of their grandkids or more of the ministries that they'd been involved in over the years would approach them a little bit more aggressively and credibly about their need for funds, because their hearts were wide open. It is one of the biggest challenges of the last half of life, is disposing of income in ways that honor the values of the person who is stewarding it. Again, being courageous and asking is because we want to save you from rummage sales and from bivocationalism in cases where it's not necessary and where you haven't fully leveraged the opportunity to raise up dollars from others. Letter C, growing individual external donors. And here we go. As you're thinking about who you approach, I alluded to my parents a moment ago. Who do you know? It's time to sit down and build a list. I remember my daughter telling me when she was trying to raise money for her mission project, she had to come up with 100 donors, 100 names that she could approach. And she said, Dad, where will I ever come up with 100 names? She was absolutely frozen. But she came up with way more than 100 names when she started looking at all the relatives and the friends and the family. And she began to think again those names that she's crossed off and said, I could never ask them. But then she thought again, no, my job is to be a stewardship developer and to help people to take hold of the life that's truly life, to know the joy of generosity. And as she stepped into that courageously and stopped making it about her and her paycheck, it's not about you, and not about your paycheck. It's not about raising money for your budget. It's about growing generosity in the lives of others. She got after it, and she was able to raise her funds. She had some wonderful years at the University of Istanbul doing work and had a great experience that way, growing, and people got excited about her ministry. So who do you know? Build your long list of donors. You can come up with way more than 100. And then how can you romance them? How can you cultivate that relationship? And how can you be very specific about the ask and help them fit in? And then the power of the thank you. Here's a principle. It's always easier to grow an existing giver than it is to get a new one. And so once people begin to give, oh my sakes, don't make the fatal mistake of taking that check to the bank, cashing it, and then getting on to the next thing. Send that thank you note. People big time notice that when you acknowledge their gift, their hearts leap. In fact, there's a good verse of scripture. It says, where your treasure is, your heart is also, right? So people have already moved some of their treasure in your direction of your ministry. Their heart's with you. And when you acknowledge that gift, their heart leaps. And you have an opportunity to share with them ministry progress and to continue to hold open for them opportunities to give in a gracious way, at the right time, in the right way. Who else will you be able to tell the story to of what's going on in your ministry? And then how will you report to them at the end of the year what's been done with their gift? A ministry update. This is the year-end stakeholder report. That kind of a communication goes a long way to engaging donors for the next year at perhaps a higher level. So developing your donor list of friends and families and church and work colleagues and neighbors and people you have impacted. Each should receive a case statement, a response card, contact information, and added to your email prayer list. That's always a great principle. Start by asking them, will they be a part of a prayer team for you? And would they consider also being a contributor for a period of time, 1 year at a time, 2 or 3 years max, asking them to step into that role. Your network of prospects is larger than you think. Second principle is qualifying your donors. What's their relationship to you? People give to people that they feel a connection with. What's their capacity to give? Larger donors often give more strategically. And see what's their affinity to your mission. I've given you a scale of 1 to 5 on each one of those. It's not a bad idea to take that list of 100 plus names and to score each one of them in 3 columns. Their relationship to you, their capacity to give, their affinity to your mission. And then, to some extent, to prioritize them and say, how will I spend my time and energy in trying to approach this large of a group of contacts in light of the limitations that you have. I mentioned a couple sessions ago about a donor matrix, and it's one way of presenting opportunity to donors is say, I'm looking for a number of people to step in at a number of different levels. I heard an individual share recently a provocative statement, might be worth a conversation with you about. Here was the statement. He said, you never dishonor someone by asking them to give more. If anything, you kind of dishonor them by asking them to give too little. I mean, think about it. I had an individual who told a story about how he had a church planter step into their office on an appointment and ask for a gift. Now, this gentleman ran a trucking business in which he had multiple over-the-road semis, and he had built a big business. He was quite wealthy. He had properties in several parts of the country, and he was, by many measures, he was wealthy. The person stepped into his office, and that individual was a person that was doing mission work. The mission work, it was in an area that this individual was fond of. The person stepped into the office and asked him for $1,000. My friend, whose name is Raleigh, he said it was almost an insult. That was the number that was shared. He said, I was prepared to give much more. And I thought about that and heard others say similarly, when I'm asked much more, and I've been asked much more of, I've had to pick myself up off the ground, but it's caused me really to think. My wife and her congregation are currently in the midst of a development campaign, and they're taking a very aggressive role with the people in the congregation as they're adding a new facility and building out their property significantly. And they're taking the perspective that you never dishonor someone by asking them for more than they might have expected. They may not step up to it, but you challenge them to grow. And so don't be afraid to evaluate your donors and then make a courageous ask that might be a little more perhaps than you have initially been thinking. Here's 4 qualities in making the ask. Again, it's about relationship. The stronger the relationship, typically, the larger the ask you can make, because there's homophily, and there's sameness, there's connectivity, relationship, and now you can go into a trophily. Remember that word? You can go into a very uncomfortable place with them, and that will be life-giving in terms of the relational and the spiritual and the stewardship growth for that person. Secondly, responsibility. Plan to report back with stories. Third, credibility. Money follows fruitfulness. Fourth, honesty. Of course, don't forget to share all of what's going on in the ministry. Energy and passion. Speak to their heart and from your heart. Involve the donor, if possible, in the plant, especially around the issue of prayer and their partnering with you in prayer. Challenge your donor with a target ask, as we've illustrated. Number 5, mature your donors. Acknowledge each gift. Update communication with prayer needs monthly and quarterly. Develop a two-way relationship, praying for your donor and taking interest in what's going on in their life. I've had many ministry leaders report that this stewardship conversation with another person takes their relationship with that person into a whole new level of intimacy and transparency about what's really going on in that person's life. Don't be surprised if that occurs. Be mindful of that donor's fiscal year with timely updates and requests. Find out if you're approaching a person who has prerogatives over their business and their business's fiscal year and what they might do with their capital gains. Annual full financial and ministry results disclosure is always part of growing your donors and maturing them in their confidence in your leadership of your ministry. Next, let's talk about developing internal givers. We're back to this latter step of 6 sequential growth plateaus for people as they're maturing. Think about the people who will give to your ministry and who are internal to it. There's really 3 publics, 3 populations. There's the people who pay, and we've talked about them, the people who pay for services rendered. They got childcare, they heard a sermon, there were some donuts and coffee in the foyer, There's the people who will pray. There's the people who will give. Those are the people who will genuinely be growing as stewards. And then there's the people who will endow. The people for whom they have a planned giving estate kind of transaction to settle in your favor. Think about those 3 publics and their pockets. Think about how you're developing each one in a unique way. Those folks that will perhaps be making a planned gift. It's a big mistake congregations have, not to have an occasion to gather folks together who may be making estate plans and having a conversation with them and urging them to include the congregation and your long-term objectives into their estate planning. Don't fail to pay attention to those folks, because they're oftentimes the key to your property development and your overall long-term capital development objectives. Second, think about the offering and the way you're doing the offering. I've watched too many church planters that have settled for a mute offering moment. That is to say that, they'll put a box in the back, or they'll otherwise really not talk about giving in the service because they're so afraid they're going to drive people away. Here's the reality. Stewardship abhors a vacuum. That is, the absence of a conversation about stewardship results in the loss of the stewardship value. You're working upstream in this area constantly. The way of thinking will always revert to, it's my money, and it's none of your business to talk with me about it. And so it'll always be your challenge to be a graceful, creative, innovative, but direct communicator about the value of generosity in your culture. I worked in a large church for a number of years, and we had a staff person who was our administrative pastor. One of his responsibilities was to develop the stewardship moment every single weekend. And he would come up with a 1 or 2 line statement, a quick visual, a small little illustration that was memorable, brief, and to the point, such that no one ever got the idea that stewardship was just a filler. It was always something of value. And I would encourage you to put that in front of your finance team or your worship arts team as an area for them to think about. How could we take a step towards at least once a month or at least every other week, devoting 60 seconds to something beyond just the old tired, the ushers will now come and take up a collection, right? Because if you don't do that, if you don't make some effort to be creative that way, people will revert to their old habits and patterns. Publish your need weekly if you want to help people become regular stewards. You can't expect people to go someplace where they don't know. And so being clear about what your needs are. I've watched too many ministry leaders not be transparent, that they're embarrassed or uncomfortable or feel like they'd prefer not to. And then they wonder why the ministry struggles with funding. So publish your needs weekly in order for people to track with how the church is doing and how they might need to step up. Electronic giving, tons of step forwards in this dimension in the recent decade. You're probably aware to some extent of Kickstarter. You're probably aware of some of the other mobile apps that are available, such that direct deposit, giving kiosks, and these kinds of strategies go a long way towards introducing ways of giving that millennials and others are more comfortable with. I mean, who carries around that much cash? Who carries around a checkbook? All right? So if you aren't prepared to receive donations in the ways that people are more comfortable giving today, you're going to pay a price for that. So go online, look at some of the various organizations, Vanco, others that are there, and talk with other ministries that are effective in this area and steal their ideas. One strategy that I've found to be helpful is the development of a stewardship card, such that individuals who make their direct deposit or have another way of giving apart from giving through the regular offering, that they have a way of acknowledging that by putting something in the offering on Sundays. Consider electronic giving as the wave of the future and get on board with it. Commitment cards. Here's an annual way of developing stewardship in congregation by asking people to make an annual commitment. It's a really healthy, what some congregations used to call faith promise strategy, where someone takes the need of the next year of the ministry to see the congregation step up to a budget after you've had an annual meeting in which your budget has been agreed on by the congregation. And you take that home and you say, now what's going to be our part? The church needs to raise $200,000, whatever it is, to meet our budget. What will our family do? And to say, you know what, God being our helper, God being our provider, us growing as stewards, we'd like to commit to giving 3, 4, 5%, 6, 8, 10% more. We want to make that commitment, and then to share that commitment card with the leadership of the church and say, this is what God being our helper, we'd like to trust God to do in our lives and through us. That kind of a commitment card exercise is one that you can lead your people through. Some have called it a 90-day stewardship test, where you say, if you'll make this commitment before God, let the Lord prove that God will provide for you and that you can be a good steward and still experience all that you need. All your needs will be provided. So think about a commitment card exercise as one tool that might and strategy you might use to grow up the internal giving in your congregation. Number 5, think about capital campaigns. Some of you will be there someday. Some of you may be there sooner than you expect. The rule of thumb is that most churches can raise 2.5 times their annual giving for a capital endeavor that they buy into. And most new churches don't start capital campaigns soon enough, and the result is a 2-year delay, oftentimes, in ministry growth. Your church should be thinking about a capital campaign into its 3rd or 4th year in most cases, because it will take 3 or 4 years to complete that capital campaign, at which point your church could be at the 6 or 7 year developmental phase. And in many cases, not all, but many cases, you'd be ready then to move into your own facility. Don't put this off too far down the road. It comes up sooner than you think. And consulting with resources at the annual conference can help you in that process of capital development. Number 6, teaching on stewardship. You'd think I'd never got there, but teaching on stewardship values and principles in your church plant is just kind of a no-brainer. And finding a way to do that in a kind of a annual fashion that does not necessarily sequence to a moment of desperation. You don't want to teach on stewardship just when you're in a place of great need. You want to teach on stewardship as a principle, a deep rudder that guides your ministry, regardless of whether there's a tremendous need in the moment, a crisis, or not. Like Henry Nouwen said, this is not about crisis. This is about principle and about value. I remember a congregation I worked with a number of years ago. They had a big styrofoam numbers that they kept back in a storage room. And the styrofoam numbers were 10, 10, 80. Some of you know exactly where this is going. Every year, they would drag out the 10, 10, 80 styrofoam numbers. They were larger than life. And stick them up on the platform. And everybody knew that we were going into the Stewardship Series. And the Stewardship Series was all about 10% belongs to God, 10% is for your long-term saving, and you live on 80%. Now, I'll grant you that that's terribly formulaic and very unsophisticated, and you can trash it easy. But the idea is that it became a symbol in that congregation that stewardship was a holistic way of thinking about your finances. And it came around every year, and it had nothing to do with a crisis in the life of the church. It had everything to do with people being more mature in their personal finance, not being a hostage to personal indebtedness, and being generous and being stewards in their relationship to the church. So John Wesley's little adage, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can, is not a bad sermon series. Whatever works for you. Here are the action areas coming out of this final session. Is if you're in the process of raising external funds, develop a donor list of 100 and a strategy to share your ministry with, using that case for support statement and some of the communication strategies we've talked about and the follow-up strategies we've talked about. Begin to work your donor list to raise the startup funds. For some of you, many of you, 10% of your overall external funding, to begin the process of raising that startup money. Number 2, if you're developing a stewardship culture internally, develop a team to evaluate every aspect of your plan using the 6 strategies that I've outlined here. And God bless you as you remember that stewardship development is not what we do so that we can do ministry. Stewardship development is ministry. It is making disciples of our Lord. God bless you in that.